Let's continue to examine the work of French professor Albert Slosman. Slosman believed those who were fortunate enough to escape Pêr-Ahâ fled in all directions, driven by desperation. Many sailed eastward, making landfall on the African coasts. Others were cast westward, eventually reaching the shores of the Americas. This scattering formed the bedrock of later civilizations. The survivors knew that they had brought the catastrophe upon themselves by violating the divine laws that once held their world in balance. In Slosman's words, those who escaped divine wrath understood they were themselves the architects of their downfall, and they wept, giving thanks to the Eternal not in triumph, but in contrition. This recognition of divine order violated, and the humility of survival would shape the moral foundations of the civilizations to come. Foremost among those who had not lost the vision was the final Pêr-Ahâ, the last great divine ruler of Atlantis. Long before the collapse, he had foreseen the coming destruction and pleaded for repentance, only to be mocked by a priesthood too corrupted to hear. Undeterred, he embarked on an immense construction program, commissioning the building of 200,000 manjit. These sacred star-guided vessels were designed to ride the tidal fury of the world's unraveling. These unsinkable barks, guided by the stars, as Slosman called them, were not only magnificent feats of engineering, they were the final lifeline for a chosen remnant of society. But these boats, sister ships of Ra's celestial bark and ancestral to Noah's Ark, were more than transportation devices. They were the last bridges between worlds, between spirit and matter. The survivors did not conquer new lands, they survived the old. As Slosman described, the sacred boats tossed by the unleashed elements ran aground wherever fate would take them. It was survival, not conquest. Along the African coast, the cataclysm was less devastating. Tremors shook the earth, and some low-lying lands vanished beneath the waves, but overall, the geography remained intact. Many settlements had already been wisely placed in the highlands of the Atlas and Upper Nile regions. Mining colonies and trade outposts, remnants of earlier Atlantean activity, now served as points of refuge. According to Slosman, mining colonies and trade outposts were already established on secure highlands. These stations, manned by specialist castes of navigator sages and metallurgists, became sanctuaries for the arriving refugees. Long before the fall, these personnel had worked to extract sacred metals and crystals from the African mountains, attuned not only to material value, but to geomagnetic and spiritual harmonics. Some parts of the African coastline were indeed altered, small peninsulas submerged, ancient ports lost, but the overall configuration of the land remained stable. Egypt, untouched by the total annihilation of Pêr-Ahâ, would soon become what Slosman called the base of renewal, a world still intact where the memory of Pêr-Ahâ would reincarnate. This sanctuary spared the full wrath of the abyss and became the seedbed of sacred continuity. The refugees who landed there did so in large numbers, their ships arriving along coasts separated from Atlantis by what Slosman termed the mouths of the fissure, a narrow strait of roughly 100 kilometers, possibly akin to the modern Strait of Gibraltar or a now-vanished mid-Atlantic ridge. It had been, as he described, a maritime passage known to the wise navigators but became an abyss after the fall. The Atlanteans had known these lands well. Their maps traced the contours of the Atlantic coasts, and their star-guided vessels had traveled to Africa, Europe, and even the far shores of the Americas. Navigation for them was not guesswork, but sacred science. As Slosman recorded, the navigators of Pêr-Ahâ knew how to read the skies and currents. Their ships reached the African, European, and American shores. Yet, when they stepped once more onto the familiar lands of Africa, the survivors felt as if they had entered a different world. Though they had seen these shores before, the trauma of the cataclysm had severed their connection to the old Earth. They had crossed not only distance, but a threshold of being. The Earth was no longer the same after the cataclysm. Slosman wrote, "Every shore seemed foreign, even if familiar. The sacred world was now lost. The winds had scarcely calmed, and the seas still rolled with fury when they arrived. Their landing was not chosen, it was dictated by chaos. The Manjit, those sacred vessels built to carry divine memory across the waters of destruction, were scattered and dashed across unfamiliar shores. Yet the survivors endured as stewards of a shattered legacy, charged with keeping the flame alive in a world gone dim. And so, beneath a newly foreign sky, the survivors stood not only on an altered Earth, but within an altered cosmos. The constellations had shifted, the rhythms of time were broken, and what had once been a universe of harmony had become a realm of dissonance. The divine calendar, once kept in lockstep with the stars and the Earth's sacred axis, was now obsolete. What had occurred was not just the loss of land, but the collapse of the very mathematical combinations that underpinned divine order. These harmonics, encoded in star paths, seasonal alignments, and ritual cycles, were, as Slosman said, the mathematical combinations of divine law. With their rupture, a new cosmic age was born in dissonance. As the survivors tried to rebuild their sense of orientation, they observed with awe and horror that the sun no longer followed its accustomed path. The very pivot of the heavens had changed. Before the cataclysm, it had risen in the west in accordance with a now-forgotten cosmic design. But on this first day of the new Earth, the sun emerged from the east. The survivors soon understood that the world had literally turned. The sun did not move, Slosman writes, but the Earth, struck in its rotation, shifted its axis. This new eastern sunrise became the marker of the following cycle. The Atlanteans, who had once possessed a faultless understanding of the cosmos, down to the precessional movement of the equinoxes, now saw their entire framework undone in an instant. Their sacred signs, carved in stone and remembered in song, had spoken often of the age of the lion, the time of balance, of power, and of divine presence. That age had ended with the deluge, yet the survivors, watching the stars recalibrate themselves, saw something strange. The sun appeared once again in the constellation of Leo, but moving backward. This was not a return, but a regression, a symbolic mirror of the fall they had just endured. Leo was the sacred constellation of Pêr-Ahâ, wrote Slosman. The sun's retrograde return to that figure signaled the dawn of a new age of memory and penitence. The heavens, once a clock of divine precision, had become a mourning veil. The Earth's new tilt had dislodged everything, and the sun, once worshipped for its constancy, now testified to a broken covenant. The trauma was total. The navigators, whose maps once linked stars to temples and coasts to constellations, found themselves adrift on an Earth whose features had become unfamiliar. The navigators found themselves lost on an unrecognizable Earth, Slosman explains. Celestial and terrestrial markers had dislocated in an instant. Even those lands that were spared direct annihilation, like Egypt, seemed spiritually exiled from the former world. The survivors wandered not only through strange landscapes, but across a wounded dimension. What had once been whole was now fractured. The sacred flows of energy, the meridians of cosmic law, had been misaligned. The balance between earth and heaven, maintained through rituals, temples, and knowledge of divine science, had been torn. The cataclysm, then, was not just geological or atmospheric, it was metaphysical. The link between the eternal and the material had been stretched to the breaking point. And yet, even in this devastation, the survivors bore within them the fragments of the first time. Their temples, though buried, would rise again. Their science, though scattered, would echo in Egypt, in Sumer, and in the Andes. Their knowledge of sacred geometry and celestial cycles would persist, though encoded in myth and ritual. The memory of Amenemhat would not vanish entirely. It would live on in the rites of sighs, in the Platonic dialogues, and in the stone alignments of Giza. It would be remembered not just in names, but in directions of sunrise, in the layout of temples, and in the prayers murmured to an invisible sun god whose course had changed. Thus began the slow, painful effort to recalibrate time, to recover the broken law of the stars, and re-anchor human destiny to cosmic order. The Atlanteans turned Egyptians would seek to reconstruct the lost harmony, using sacred architecture, calendar reform, and ritual procession as tools of reattunement. But they knew, as Slosman affirmed, that this new age was born in dissonance. And the true harmony of the past could not be recovered in full. It could only be remembered. It could only be mourned. The divine golden age had ended in water and flame. What followed was the age of rebuilding, of veiled truths and encoded wisdom